Okay. Take us into the moment where you decided to pen all your experiences down, to start writing. What was that moment like?
For my book?
For just life, like your writing journey. When did that begin?
Oh my gosh, Ishan.
Yeah, we're starting hard.
Oh my God, we really are. It never felt like I made that decision. I started writing. I guess the first real thing that was like me getting into it was my college diary. It was like this place where, or this time in my life that was just so humiliating and painful and shameful that sometimes it would just be like, oh, this is so horrible. I need to go somewhere with it that's not just me sitting in my brain, because it's so horrible when it's just in my brain. So I would go into this diary and I would write about these, mostly boy things and like stuff with my body image and my weight, because I always wanted to lose weight, and it was just like it was a very dark time of my life. So that's when I think I like started writing because I needed to. And then I was moving across the country from New Jersey to California, which had been like a dream for most of my life. I wanted to become a famous actress, and I had nothing in California waiting for me there. I had no friends, I had no family, I had no job. And I was moving out there with my boyfriend at the time, my ex-boyfriend now. And when I was getting ready to move, somebody made the suggestion that I start a blog and I write about my adventures, my traveling across the country. And it was an idea that stuck. And up until that point, I had always enjoyed um, writing for myself, like in my diary and things like that. But the idea of writing a blog just gave me something that was like something stable and something that I could do every day. So I wrote a blog every single day for 3 months when I first moved out to California. And it was great because it was a scary move to move all the way across the country. And I was away from all my family and friends. And it was like kind of a way for my mom and my friends to keep tabs on me and like update them on like, here's a day in the life of me going to California without having to call everybody on the phone and like check in with them, because I wasn't going to do that. So then once I did that for 3 months, I tapered off after that to once a week. And it was just something that like gave me a little bit of a sense of purpose. Like, I have to write my blog. I want to write my blog. Um, and in the meantime, I was like finding a waitressing job and finding an apartment that we could actually afford and figuring out how to pursue acting in California. Like, I had no idea what I was doing, but I had my blog. It was something that grounded me and that felt good. And my family and friends back home, they liked it and they appreciated it, and it made me feel like I was doing something.
Like this, from what I gather, your diary writing was perhaps a form of catharsis, and then you switched to pressing publish. And so I want to know that, like, I want to go deeper into that. What was that transition like for you? Because I can imagine that the writing that went into your diary would be a lot different from the one that you put on the internet, right?
Yeah, well, I kind of skipped a section when I just went through that. After college, my first job, my first full-time job as an adult was as a sports writer for a local newspaper in my hometown. So I worked there for a year and a half covering like local high school sports. And I didn't love it, and I knew I wasn't going to stay because my dream was to act. But I it was a rush to have my byline in the newspaper and to have people commenting on stuff that I had written. And it was like the first thing I'd ever done that like I felt like my parents were like, really proud of their daughter. Not that they weren't proud of me, but that was like it was like this really cool thing where they could actually show people like my daughter wrote this and it's in the paper. So I really liked that. And then what I didn't like, one of the things I didn't like about the sports writing was that, I learned very early on, like, you can't put your feelings, you can't put your opinion, you have to write the facts. And I hated it. I wanted to write all of those things that they said I couldn't write. And the only time I could really do that was when I got assigned a feature where I could write about a kid that was, playing badminton in college, and, or he was like this big time fish, like he was really good at fishing or something, and I could follow one person and I could interview their parents and I could interview their coach, and I could get a little bit more of that personal side. And so once I left the newspaper and somebody had the idea for the blog, it was kind of like I could finally publish, which I had liked, but I could do it the way I wanted to do it.
So now you're writing all of this into a memoir. I'm sure we'll read about it. And I want to get into that. I just had to fit in one question that as I was preparing for this, there was this one question that I didn't know where to fit. And so I'm going to have to fit that here, and then we'll get into your, this act of memoir writing. Where does now like now that you write your newsletter and you also have a podcast, and so where does that fit into your writing process? How does podcasting inform your writing process?
Oh my God. The podcast is like this such a cool thing that I wasn't expecting. I wasn't planning. So I decided to do the podcast like I think I've been doing it for like 4 years or maybe 3 years. But when I started it, it was just something fun to do with my husband. It was a way to just have a conversation with him about stuff that I couldn't talk about under my real name. So we could talk about marriage, marital arguments, and we could talk about parenting struggles because we had, we had two. I think I was pregnant with my second daughter when we started doing the podcast. It was a different way than that was different from my newsletter that was just kind of refreshing. It was just fun. Talking on a podcast is so different from writing. I am a writer first, but there was something that was just like exciting about it. So we just started doing this and it became kind of like a way for me and my husband to connect and like have like a little bit of a date, like have a real conversation with microphones on. So we just really enjoyed it. Now, after a while, aside from the podcast, I had been writing my newsletter, just trying to plug away every week, just write about whatever's going on, whatever's coming to me, whatever's personal, whatever I'm struggling with, and not knowing where any of it was going. And I started to, or no, I read a memoir by Cheryl Strayed called Wild. And as I was reading her book, I just kept noticing things that she did and thinking about how, if I were to write a memoir, how could I do this too? And as I was reading it, I was telling my husband, like, oh my God, she does this here and she has this long run on sentence. And then she like did this thing where she repeated something she said earlier and brought it back later. And he was like, you should do a podcast where you talk about what you learned from the memoir. And I was like, okay, I'll try it. So then it was just by myself. My husband's gone. And I did this first one where I talked about what I learned from her book. And then I was done. I was like, bye, Sam, you're out. This is right. This feels good. I felt more anxiety when I would have to get on a podcast with him, even though he's my husband. Like I wanted to make sure it was interesting and it wasn't boring. And I didn't know what we were going to talk about all the time. And I hated not having control over like where the conversation would go. But when it was just me and the mic talking about what I learned, I had this sense of like calmness and like excitement about it. So I started doing it. And as I was doing it, I realized that I wasn't doing a very good job because I would be like, oh my God, Cheryl Strayed is so good at run on sentences. And I would read the run on sentence and then I'd be like, isn't that great? And it's like, what are you learning? Like, so as I was doing these memoir deep dives, I call them, I started to get very granular about, okay, if something spoke to me in the book, why? What did they do exactly? And then the next piece that I had to get in order to keep it in the podcast was, how can I apply it to my own writing? So it's like, here's something that the writer did. And now here is an example from my own writing of me trying to apply what I learned. Because I think that is provides the most value to people because that's how it provides the most value to myself. I can't really learn something until I do it. So that evolved. Then randomly, I just started getting these emails from publicists because I changed the name of my podcast from Bleecker Bombs to Memoir Snob. And it was the best decision I made because as soon as my podcast was called Memoir Snob, I guess it started showing up in the algorithm or whatever in people's searches. And I had publicists reaching out to me saying, I have a writer who just wrote this book and they would be perfect for your podcast. And at first I was annoyed. I was like, you clearly don't know what I do because I don't interview authors. You haven't even listened to my podcast. And I was like offended. And then I was like, well, this is actually interesting. Let me read what these books are. And, the first couple, I was like, no, I'm not interested. And then I got this book called The Housekeeper's Secret by Sandra Schnockenberg. And I read the synopsis and I was like, okay, this looks pretty good. And so I asked her to send me the book and I read it and I loved it. And then Sandy came on my podcast and it was so cool. First of all, because I got to finish reading a book and then immediately meet the author. Like, can you imagine just getting to read books and then immediately meet the writer? It was so cool. And then I got to, I had questions. When you're reading a book, there are questions that come up. So I had questions for her. And then I was like, well, now I was probably 6 months into writing my book at that time. And I was just starting to like wonder, what am I going to do about publishing? So I'm like, okay, I'm going I'm going to talk about the writing process, which is what I've been doing with my deep dives. And then for the second part of the conversation, I'm going to ask her all I can about publishing. What route she took, how do you do it, what do I need to know, like all these things so that I can figure out what I'm going to do for my book. So I'm sorry, this is like the longest answer ever to your
No, I
question.
love that. I love that.
But
Continue, please.
this podcast is actually like the thing that is going to help me not only really learn what I'm learning from these memoirs to incorporate them into my own, but figure out how I'm going to publish my book.
Let's get into memoir writing. All right. So I have been following your writing for a while, and not once have I ever seen you. Maybe I've not followed you enough, but I've never seen you like paint yourself. Okay, I mean, this is not the best way of saying it, but I've never seen you try to paint yourself in a better light than you need to. Like, I think you're very real. And I want to ask you about that. Like, what have you ever felt the need to, sort of clean things up and make yourself look better than you actually were? Because I felt that, when I was writing my book, I really wanted to embellish certain stories or embellish my past self, but I ultimately didn't. But I had that temptation, and I want to know how you dealt with it, if you ever had.
I didn't handle it well. It took me, you must not have read the beginning stuff because I wouldn't say that I necessarily tried to make myself look better because I was okay with that part, but I made other people look bad. There was a lot of blame in my earlier stuff and judgment, and I think I painted myself as not the hero, which is I think what you're saying, but as the victim. And so I would blame other people and get mad at other people, and it was kind of like a poor me situation. Instead of taking ownership for my part in it, because with everything, it's a two-way street. And if I can, blame my brother, for example, and just make a blanket statement, which like he's an asshole, that is not okay. It is not okay because for me to come to that conclusion, for me to say that line, my brother's an asshole, is completely unfair to him. And it's not taking ownership over my part in the relationship. And I'm sure that if my brother had the microphone, he could have a few choice words to say about me. So how can I be fair and just and talk about my what am I trying to say? All of my missteps and my negative qualities. Like what am I doing? Where can I improve? And talk about that instead of, making these blanket statements about other people. So in the beginning, that is what I did. And by reading all these other memoirs and reading the ones that were really good, I noticed that my favorite writers never did that. They presented information, they told dialogue of things that were said, but they never painted themselves as the victim, and they didn't blame other people.
Okay, on this part of taking ownership, was that something you felt after you wrote like the first draft? Like, did writing about your past, just take one instance, did writing about that instance change the way you saw it?
Totally.
Or did you, okay, walk me through that. Walk me through how writing
Okay, well,
changed the way
let's
you looked
let's
at it.
take my ex-boyfriend, for example, chapter 1 of my book. In early drafts, I wrote that he was a mean drunk and that basically he wasn't nice to me. Now, that is so unspecific, and as hard as I tried, I could not think of, and it was so long ago and I did not write about any of this stuff as it happened, so it's hard to remember. I could not think of any specific example where he was mean to me that I could remember why, or like anything he said specifically. And without specifics, you have nothing. So it wouldn't be fair to say that he was a mean drunk without telling a story about it, without giving an anecdote. And also, I wasn't the nicest when I was drunk either. So it would be an unfair picture, to just say that he was a mean drunk. So when I rewrote it, I just took that whole part out. And so if you are reading my book, you do not know that my ex-boyfriend was a mean drunk. Instead, I wrote that we would go to a backyard party and we would stand on opposite sides of the lawns and I would glare at him and he would be, playing beer pong with his partner and I'd be standing on the other side fuming at him because, and this was where I had to dig because I'm like, why? Why was I so mad at him for playing beer pong with his friends? It was because that I wanted more attention and I wanted more affection and I wanted him to tell me and show me more often how much he loved me and how great I was. Now, when I was before writing that chapter, I didn't really put that together. I just knew that I was unhappy in that relationship and I was mad at him all the time. And if you knew us at that time, you would say that we fought all the time. But you can't write a memoir and say we weren't nice to each other and we fought all the time because it's unspecific. So going through that and digging through and figuring out like what was going on for me helped me see my ex in a I was much more empathetic to what he went through because I was so angry at him and I couldn't verbalize why. So that had to be confusing for him. Like I'm always yelling at him and I'm always expecting him to do all these things for me, but I'm never expressing to him what are those things are that I needed.
Did you then change the writing to let that be something that the reader would then infer? Like instead of specifically laying it out, did you just set the context and then let the reader take it however they like? Like, I want to know how you thought about presenting that to the reader. I know we'll talk about the emotions of the story as well, but I really want to understand how you then structured this story while being fair to all parties involved.
It's really hard, Ishan. Like it's a very good, difficult question to answer and one that I've been thinking about a lot, which is how do you tell the story? And when do you let the story speak for itself? And when do you put in your thoughts about what's going on? And so the thing I think about now a lot is that there are there are two yous in the story. There's the you who's the character that's in the story that's experiencing the story back when it happened. And then there's the writer at the desk. And this is something I actually learned from Kate Geese, who wrote It Must Be Beautiful to Be Finished, which is another amazing memoir. I'm just saying that because, well, one, I want to credit her, and two, there's just so much I've gained from doing the podcast. But so there's two yous. So you've got you in the story back when things happened, and then you've got the writer at the desk who has all the wisdom and all the information and all the hindsight to consider. And so what do you put in? And that is where, that's where you have to make those creative decisions of what goes in and how it goes in. Now, I have learned that when you are telling the story from the version of you back then, you have to tell the story from the version of you back then. That means if you said something mean, you can't caveat it and say, like, and then I said this really mean thing that I shouldn't have said, blah, 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 blah. No, you embody yourself back then and you say, and then I said, like, that this is how I felt. This was right. This is the mean thing that I said, and it was good and right. And I am embodying me back then, and I want the reader to know that this is me back then. I don't need to explain that I feel bad about something that I said back then, because then the reader kind of like it's like this kind of pity feeling, like, oh, they feel bad about it, and now I feel bad for them, and that doesn't feel good as a reader to feel pity for the writer. So you embody yourself from that perspective back then. So then what are you bringing into it? What is the wisdom you're bringing into it? Well, in this case, I could say that we stood on opposite sides of the backyard lawn, me clutching my red Solo cup and him playing beer pong with his partner and laughing obnoxiously on the other side of the lawn. Like, that's how I feel about it back then. That's what I could see with my eyes. But then when I bring in my present knowledge, I said something like, I wanted it to be like it was when we first met, when he showered me with affection and told me how much he loved me and told me I was beautiful and things like that. I wanted that back, but I didn't know how to say that to him, so I just expected it. So that is present knowledge about the past that I think is important for the reader to know. Because if I just said we stood on opposite sides of the backyard lawn and I was angry at him, it's a kind of one-dimensional. It doesn't let you understand what I needed, because at the time I didn't know that that's what I needed. I couldn't articulate that. But now as a writer at the desk, I do know that, and I feel like that is important information to share. So that doesn't really answer your question. I'm just trying to give you like one example of how I approach it. But when you bring in your present knowledge, it's very important to not celebrate your present self or condemn your past self. Like, I was immature and I should have known better and it wasn't fair to him. Like, I cannot put in any of that, or at least like I can't, because when I read that in other people's memoirs, I lean away from the book. I'm not as interested in reading that because I want a writer who's going to just put themselves in the moment and just share it. Just share the ugly parts of themselves without explaining or apologizing for the ugly parts of themselves.
So then, in a way, I think what I really appreciate, I think, of course, your candidness, but that is something I think that you are now known for. I can't think of Charlie Bleecker and, filtered. That those two words just don't go together. And I love that. I also feel like you have a very clear idea that that you're writing this for the reader. It's not, I mean, I'm just comparing it to myself. I remember writing it and not thinking about the reader at all. I was just, at least my book, I just thought about myself. I was seeing this as a way to relive my past experiences, and it was me first. And so were you like this from the get-go, like in your book process? No?
No, no, no. All of this stuff has been then that's why when I wrote the first draft and then I went back to the second draft, like I would go back to a chapter and be like, "Oh my god, I got to rewrite the whole thing. This is terrible." Like I've learned all these things from reading these memoirs and talking to these authors. Like I have to fix it. I can't believe I wrote it this way. So I'm like still as I'm writing the book learning so much and things are changing. I think when you are writing in the beginning, I think it's totally natural and good to write for yourself. But there is a writer named J.R. Moringer, who I love. He wrote The Tender Bar, which is one of my favorite memoirs, and he ghost wrote for Shoe Dog, which is Phil Knight's memoir, another one, and then Prince Harry's memoir. And he wrote an article about being the ghostwriter for Prince Harry's memoir, and he said that memoir isn't about you, because he had this whole story about how Prince Harry had this. He was in the military or something, and they were doing a what's it called? A simulation. And these guys that were just, he was in training. These guys, like, they were tortured. And at the end of it, they made a dig about his mom, Princess Diana. And in this real story, Prince Harry, like, had this big comeback to them. And he, like, put them in their place by saying something to them. And JR is his ghostwriter. And they had this big fight because JR is like, take it out. That line should not be in there. You don't need to write the thing that you said back to them. And Prince Harry is like, no, this is what happened. This is what I said. I want the reader to know that I had this comeback. And JR was like, the memoir is not about you. It's a story carved from your life that will most resonate with the reader. And the only way for a story to resonate with the reader is if the reader can see themselves in the story. And if you're putting in all your comebacks and all your feelings and all your thoughts, the reader can't see themselves in the story because it's still your story. So I want the reader to be able to read my story and have all these feelings for themselves that they can maybe see themselves in it.
Is this something that you do maybe unconsciously in your newsletters? I think you do, but I want to know if it's intentional from your side. Do you want the reader to read, say, an anecdote that you're writing about and then think of a similar anecdote in their life and then just go off on a tangent in their own head? Because that's what happens. As a reader, I can say that.
I would love that to happen. That's not my goal. I think the thing I want most is that the reader feels a big feeling. I want them to feel hot with emotion when they read something I write. And if that means what you're saying because they're thinking about something in their own life, then that's great. But it's really just that I want them to feel so much emotion. And what I think works is that by taking my emotion out of the writing, it allows the reader to feel that emotion that I want them to feel.
Deep, deep stuff. Yeah, uh, I mean, yeah, let's talk about how we got here. Okay, so all right, so you have written, and I counted I mean, I didn't count it. You wrote it 271 issues of your newsletter. Now, okay, I think we should explain for those who don't know what a newsletter is. A newsletter is a weekly email that goes out with a piece of writing, which then like lives in an archive, which you can then read later. And you wrote all this under a pseudonym. And so I think for the people listening to this podcast who don't know it yet, Charlie Bleecker is not her real name. It's something else. Maybe, I mean, I don't know. We'll find out when the book is out. And so take me into that. Can you? And I know this is an answer you've given many times because I've heard you give this many times in Rite of Passage. But take us into what it's like to write under a pseudonym. Like
It's the
why
best.
a pseudonym?
So
Lovely.
it's so freeing. So there's such a safety in writing under a pseudonym. The initial reason why I wanted to write under a pseudonym, which was actually my husband's suggestion, was because I was feeling very stuck. I mentioned writing my blog for all those years. I never stopped writing my blog. There were periods where it slowed down, but it was always there. It was something I always turned to make sense of things. And I had gotten to a point where I was very stuck, where I wanted to write things and I felt like I couldn't because I had gotten in trouble for writing about other people, and also because there were things in my life that I wanted to write about that I did not feel safe to. So I wanted to write. I had written a little bit about struggling with drinking and my body image stuff, and that was okay. But then I started working at a school, and And then it was like, oh, I have to think about my bosses, reading what I write. And now I had other stories that I wanted to tell about using drugs, which I definitely couldn't write about. And I had just like more like, when I was writing stuff about like drinking and my body image stuff, it was always from a lens of improving, doing better. I'm drinking less and I'm being healthier with how my relationship with my body. So it was always from this lens of improving myself. And I also couldn't tell stories that involved people because, especially like family members, they would get upset with me. And around this time is when I got married. And at the wedding, I just like turned into a bridezilla and was very upset with a lot of my family members. And when I got home from the wedding, I was just like, it was all I could think about. And I wanted to write about it and I couldn't because I was mad at everybody and I was going to make it known if I wrote about it. And these were not kinds of conversations that I would have with family members. Like we did not have direct confrontations with each other about this stuff. So I had to just shove it in a box in my head and then it made me not want to write anything because that's what I wanted to write about. And so that's when my husband was like, you should write under pseudonym. And I didn't want to because I had been writing my blog for so long and I had my website and I had my, people who read it, which was not a big audience. It was family and friends. I don't even know how many people read it. Maybe 50 to 100 people. But I was just like it was too scary to think about starting new and creating a website, which I just like didn't know how to do that. It was just so stressful to me. But then at the same time, he told me about this writing course, Write a Passage, and then it was like, okay, I started to just like imagine, like if I were to write under a pseudonym, I would write about my wedding and I would write about all these, things that happened that I wanted to write about. And suddenly it was very exciting. I was like, oh, I could say this and I could say this. So then the decision was kind of simple after that. And I took the course, I went in as my real name and I came out as Charlie
Oh my God. And I love that it's Bleecker because there's a street named Bleecker in somewhere in the US, I think New York. Wait, that's
in
where
Manhattan.
Doctor
Yeah.
Strange is from.
No
Uh,
way.
uh, yeah, yeah. I mean, that the Marvel character. Now I'm remembering. Yeah. So I was trying to get into your head, all right? And I have a trick question for you. I could be totally off, but I was just trying to imagine if I was writing under a pseudonym and I'd written 271 issues at this point, I would almost think of the pseudonym as a character. I can totally imagine myself going in this direction where where this character now is detached from myself. Was that ever the case with you, or were you clear that you weren't? I mean, because I know it's not fiction, so you did write about real life stories, but were you able to get yourself associated with that new name, and so and then write about it as such, or did you feel that distance? Am I making sense?
No, this is something that people have asked me before, which is there's never been any separation from Charlie. I definitely identify as Charlie. I love Charlie. Charlie's better than I am. She's still me, but she's just, she is way more confident than I am. But she's still me. Like everything I write is just me. She's rational. She's thoughtful. I really like her. I think the confidence piece is the biggest difference because when I am out in my life as myself, people don't know Charlie. And Charlie is like everything I'm working towards. It's like it's my writing, it's my podcast, it's my book, it's my passion, my drive, my purpose, my fulfillment. Like everything is wrapped up in Charlie. And when I'm out there as myself, I don't talk about it. And so there is a sense that I've always felt that I am not worthy unless I am successful, and I am not successful unless I am making money. And I am still not making money as Charlie, but when I'm Charlie, like you know me as Charlie, I feel very confident around you because I know that you know that I'm doing something of value. And I feel good that you have access to that. But the people in my real life, they don't have access to that. So then I feel like I'm like, no, I am worthy. I swear, like I'm desperate for people to understand that I'm worthy without being able to tell them the secret. And I hate that I care, that, I need to prove to them and show them that I'm worthy. But that is, that's just the messiness of me.
I think your honesty is one of your best qualities. Let me just throw that in there because I mean I've known you for a while. I admire it. I really admire it. And you know I would hate if this ever happened. Have you ever written? Okay, so you're still writing under a pseudonym, but have you ever written anything? And has anyone said that you are oversharing? Because I can imagine that being such a crushing thing to hear. I mean, just me thinking about this hypothetical situation is giving me like shivers. I hope that's never happened, but has it?
Never. No one has ever written or said that I've overshared. Now, I have had other complaints. Usually, I've had complaints from strangers about writing when I've I've written as honestly as I can about a parenting moment, which I can think of one example where I wrote about this time when my husband went away for 3 nights to Canada for a work trip, and I was home with my toddlers by myself, and I did not handle it well, and it was a horrible, horrible, showing. I did not like the person that I was in this, 2 nights or 3 nights, and I shared it. I shared the ugliness that I was. I shared yelling at my son. I shared that, he wanted to give me a hug and I turned like away from him, or I can't remember what I did. But just, I could not handle being a parent, and that is embarrassing, and that I just like I had no patience for them, and I even had help, and I was just like, when is she like, I need her to get here now. Like, I need help. And I had people respond to this, rightly so, by the way, that are just like, I think both the two people that responded were single moms. And they are just like, you have no fucking clue. They didn't say that. This is how I'm interpreting what they said. Like, come on, get your act together. Like, grow up and, put your big girl pants on and step up to the plate. What they didn't understand was that that's the point. That's why I'm sharing it. I like that they reacted that way because it made them feel a big emotion. Now, I did not say that to them, but if in that piece I had apologized and made excuses and said like I'm not a good parent, I didn't show up. I didn't say any of that because that's not an honest look at where I was in that moment. I wanted you to see it raw. This is who I was then, and it's ugly. And I'm not going to say it was ugly. I'm just going to show you the ugliness, and you can decide for yourself. But aside from that, no, I've never gotten anything but love.
Let's talk about now craft of writing, because that's actually how we met. We were at in Write of Passage, the writing course where you first sliced up one of my drafts, and in the nicest way. I mean, no, as in the harshest ways possible, but in the nicest, one of the nicest things that happened to me because I mean, I really improved from it. And so I want to talk about writing voice. All right, so you have very clearly developed a voice over these 271 issues. Is that something that you consciously recognized that you were developing a style? Like, what is your relationship with your writing voice?
Hmm. I think that voice is something that happens over a really long time. And the only way you're going to like really establish your voice is to write a lot and to publish a lot. You can't just write it for yourself. It has to be published. You got to put it out on the internet for people to see. And I think that there are moments where your voice is really just confidence in what you're saying, because there were times in the past where I would write something, and I don't have an example, but, like, I would write it and I'd be like, "Oh gosh, what are people gonna think about that? Like, maybe I shouldn't write it like that," or whatever, because I wasn't sure of my voice yet, and I didn't trust, how I was writing it. And the only way to find it is to just keep trying things and see how it feels. And you'll know it's yours when you have so much confidence in the way you've written it that even if somebody doesn't respond well to it, you're like, "Well, that's me. That's how I wanna say it." So it's really just reps and practicing and trying it on. There's something we learned in Rite of Passage called imitate then innovate. And so it's like, okay, like for example, there was a book that I read that was just so beautiful called Drinking a Love Story by Caroline Knapp. And her writing blew me away. And it was so different from my writing. But I was like, okay, I want to try this on. So I tried to figure out what she did, which she used all these writing techniques. And I tried to incorporate those techniques into a newsletter that I shared. And it was fun and I enjoy doing it. And it wasn't something that stuck. I think because it's just not my style. And it's something that I could like incorporate every once in a while, but it wasn't going to be like a part of my regular thing. There are other writers where, like, for example, Jeanette Walls, she wrote The Glass Castle. This is the book that has had the most impact on my writing. And she did this thing where she, especially in the first part of the book, she did not include thoughts or feelings. She mostly wrote dialogue and action, what you could see and hear. And it was so compelling. And I was so like sweating while I was reading the book that I was like, this is what I want to do. And so then I started doing that and that stuck. And so that is, becomes a part of my style. I don't know if style is the same as voice, but when you start to do all these things that feel really good, then your voice just kind of bubbles up through it.
Oh, okay, let's assume style and voice is the same thing. At least I think we're talking about the same thing here.
Yeah.
Do you think you can have only one at one particular time? Can you like truly embody another style and switch back and forth? Because that's something I've thought about because I've sometimes felt stuck in my voice. I don't know if this ever happened to you. Like I have a story and I want to write it, and I sort of know how it's gonna come out, but I want it to I'd want to write it differently, and so I've had this sort of suffocating feeling where I want to say the story in a different manner, but I don't have the voice for it. And so, do you think you could have like more than one voice at the same time?
So Abigail Thomas is another writer. She wrote the memoir Still Life at 80. And she had certain chapters, like she would just sporadically throw in a chapter that was in third person. And I thought that was really interesting. And I really liked those chapters. And I listened to her in an interview. And she said sometimes she just like can't get into the story the way she wants to unless she's separated from it and she writes it in third person. And it just like comes out in third person. It's completely different from first person to write in third person. But she wasn't able to get into the story without it. So it's not exactly an answer to your question, but I think that if you like uh, feel like you can't get into it one way and you want to try and write it in a different way, I think you should. I think it's really fun to just play around. And that's how I approach everything. As long as you're having fun, then you should do it. I'm not going to kill myself to try to write in a different voice or try to write in a different style. It's got to just be for the fun of it, for learning, and for potentially incorporating it into the way that I already write.
Okay, so then, and where does editing fit into your voice? As in, does your voice come through when you edit, or does the voice come through in your creative phase, quote unquote, where you're just like word vomiting on the page?
So when I write a first draft, I often write my natural voice is to yell at the reader.
I love
It's
that.
to like be overly dramatic and maybe a little complainy, a little self-righteous, indignant, lots of exclamation points sometimes. Now, I will never publish that because I think that that's embarrassing, that that's what automatically comes out of me. It's something that I can work with though. And it's okay. But there have been times when usually when I'm feeling really fired up about something, that voice comes out of me. That like just this indignant, judgy, blamey, it comes out. And I will share this. Sometimes I trick myself into thinking this is good writing, and I'll share it with my husband, and he just like highlights the exact line that I thought was, so funny because I think it's funny. And he'll just say, delete. He won't even have a comment. He'll just say, delete. Like, come on. And as soon as I see that, I'm like, oh God, I'm doing that thing that I do where I'm just yelling at everybody. And so I need to fix that. So there's a casualness with that kind of voice. And I got that from writing my blog all those years. There's a very like, and can you believe
You,
this?
you
And
guys, is
you
that where you guys
guys,
came from? All
yeah, it
right.
is. Yeah. So, I think it's okay to start there, but I think editing is very important because what you are editing is going to be the final product. And this is how readers are going to, really take in what you've written.
This is not the answer I expected. I'll tell you, I'll be very honest. I like because it is a polished piece that comes in, and I'm not saying this to flatter you. I'm just saying this like as objectively. It's not. I don't read it as someone yelling at me, every week when it comes into my inbox, your
That's
newsletter.
because
It
I edit
does.
it.
Yeah. So like, give me a percentage. How much of it is writing and how much of it is editing? Because I think it would heavily lean towards editing. Is my guess now.
Well, it's changed. In the beginning, for the first year that I was writing every week, I was doing so much rewriting and editing. But the longer I've written and the more content that I put out, the more I'm able to get my rough draft is closer to a final draft, on that first pass. So it's taking less drafts to get it to the place I want it to be because now when I go into a rough draft, I already know, I'm so used to doing it that I already know like where it needs to be. So I can more naturally get it closer. So it's not often too much for my newsletter. My newsletter is very short. I'm writing 600 to 1,400 words, usually tops. Like that's the longest I'll write. I keep it short and sweet. So there's not too much to work with, and I can get it into a good place pretty quickly now. It's the times that I really need to edit is when I come in hot and I have a lot of emotion about something, that I need a little bit more reflection, a little bit of time, a little bit of space, to kind of figure out, okay, what's the point? Why am I writing this? What am I trying to get at? This is where like the cool, calm, collected Charlie Bleecker comes in, and she's like, what's going on? Are you okay? And then I'm thinking, like, what can the reader gain from this? And I'm not saying that because I've changed the way I write it, where I'm not saying that there needs to be some lesson at the end because I don't like to write like that anymore. I don't need to impart some wisdom or some value or some big grand takeaway. Sometimes I just like the story to speak for itself, but I do want the story to speak for itself. I want there to be some kind of takeaway, even if it's just for me. Like, why I have to answer the question, why am I telling this story? What am I struggling with? Maybe there's something else in here that somebody else is struggling with too. Maybe there's no answer, but maybe the fact that I'm sharing the struggle will help other people feel like they're not alone.
Wow, nice. Okay, how are you thinking about structure then as you write the memoir? And I say that with a little bit of trauma sort of resurfacing in me because
Tell me.
yeah, no, because I'll tell you, I had to change the structure of this book like thrice, no, twice, no, yeah, twice, where I
That's good. I think
initially
that's
went,
natural.
but it was traumatic. I mean, it was for the best, and so
Right.
that's why the book came out this way. But it was, I mean, it was not pretty. I was like so pissed off with my earlier self. So I started with the idea of writing a book with just essays, like one on this animal, that animal, so on. And then I'm like, oh, this is not working because I reached a point where I had to change it. So I'm like, okay, let me change it into one essay per place. So and only it was only after that didn't work out where I realized, okay, you know what, I have to just write my story.
A narrative.
From this, yeah, just from ages 14 to 21, and so that's what it finally is. And so how are you thinking about structure? Because I mean, I messed that one up big, like very very badly.
Well, it sounds like you ended up on the right path, and I think sometimes that's the only way you're going to figure it out is through trial and error. 14 to 21 is similar, not similar. Like it's a shorter timeline. It's not too long. 6 years is not too long, but
It's
you're
true.
also so young, so it probably feels longer
Yeah,
to you
that's true.
than it
That's
does
all
to
I
me.
had to work with. That's true. Yeah.
So for me, I did okay. I had the structure sort of very, very quickly. So very early on, I knew that there was a moment in my life when everything changed. And so that was like the midpoint of the book. I knew that that would be the midpoint. There'd be before this moment and then after this moment. How long before this moment and how long after this moment I had to figure out. But the moment everything changed in my life was when I read a book called The Untethered Soul. Now, that is a very boring thing to happen to change your life is to read a book. So that could not be the thing or the moment that I'm like, and then everything changed, like I had to figure out. So then I went deeper into that moment of when everything changed. And so then I had to go to the moment before that which I call is like my rock bottom, when my life was like getting to a really bad place. And so at first I was like, okay, I want the first scene in my book to show me in this dark place. And so I wanted to show me using drugs and drinking too much and maybe getting dumped by my ex-boyfriend because I was kind of like around that point, at this place, this restaurant that I worked at that was not good for me, and not having like kind of being in between living situations and stealing Adderall from my best friend. There was all these things. I was like, I'm going to show everything in this first part, and it didn't work because then it was like I was trying to force everything in, and it wasn't the way I write. I just get right into stories. And the way I write my newsletters, I jump into something that happened and I tell you a story. So I was like, okay, what am I doing here? Why am I trying to write my book different than I write? So then I decided to pick one moment that really was really bad. And so I picked the moment that I stole Adderall from my best friend. And so my prologue became that. I was like, I'm gonna start with this story where I steal the Adderall. And then I'm gonna go back in time. And this took a little bit longer, but I've realized that I wanted to make the timeline of my book be from the moment I started writing online to becoming Charlie, because it's about how writing basically saved me from this darkness in my life. So I had to go back. I started there with stealing the Adderall, and then I jumped back 5 years because 5 years prior to that was when I started the blog and moved to California. And so then when I get to the midpoint of the book, it's back to me stealing the Adderall, but now you have all the context, and now I can say more about that. And then I finish the book and I get to the end, and I knew that the end would be me calling up my friend and telling her that I stole the Adderall. And then the real part is that I wrote about it and I published it as Charlie. I published that story. And so that was my structure. That was my whole structure, was steal the Adderall, go back in time to when I started writing online, get back to the point where I stole the Adderall, and then end with confessing and writing it, because the writing is the answer to everything. And so then it was just a matter of, well, what goes in the middle of all this? And that was a little bit harder, but it was so fun because it was just like, okay, what's relevant? What stories do I want to tell? What, and it kind of just naturally unfolded after that. Now, the problem is for me with my structure, not structure, just the ending, is that I got to the end with Sasha, that's my friend, and I was like hammering away at this chapter and I just like couldn't figure out like the end, like after I do this, like what's the end so that it's not, a live, laugh, love moment at the end where I'm just wrapping everything up in a bow and I'm like, life is great and I figured it out and writing's the answer and Sasha and I are friends. Like, what is the end? And then I realized through writing the first and second draft that there's another chapter. There's more to say about Charlie Bleecker and writing. And
Oh my God. I think that's a wonderful place to leave the readers with the now rapid fire questions that I have. Where do you think when will the book be out, like tentatively? Do you have a date or like a vague idea in mind, a vague timeline?
yeah, I want to ask you about this too, because I thought that you write a book and then you publish it. Now, if you self publish, then that is correct. I do not want to self publish because I want this book to be distributed and I need help. And I want this book to get into as many hands as possible. And I'm not going to do that on my own. So I do not want to go the self publishing route. Now, after that, the question is, do I go traditional publisher or hybrid publisher, which is like, one of these boutique agencies or something? Now,
Right, right.
if I go traditional publisher, which the chances of me getting a traditional publisher are pretty slim, that takes a minimum, I've heard, of 2 years from the time that you sign. So my book should be ready at the end of August, like a draft ready. I'm sure there'll still be work to be done. At that point, I'm going to start sharing it with editors, publishers that I have created a small list from doing all these interviews of writers. And I'm going to start shipping it out and seeing if I, can make any of these connections with people. Well, then I have to wait and see how long sometimes it takes months to get responses from that. And then once that happens, um, I have to see who's interested. And then hopefully somebody wants to do the book and then it could take, another 2 years after that. So who knows?
We will have to wait and see.
We'll have to wait and see.
But however long it takes, you can be assured that I'll be in the US then. But if I'm not there by that time, I'll get a friend to send it to India because I'm waiting for that. I just have a few rapid fire questions. I have two questions. If you had to start your whole writing journey when you started the blog, when you moved, what would you do anything differently? And if you would, what would you do? And why? And your answer can be no also. That like I feel like people don't say that for these sorts of questions.
I'm so happy right now. Like the happiest I've ever been in my life is right this second. And I'm doing exactly what I'm supposed to be doing. And I've been wanting this feeling for my whole life, and I didn't even know that this was what it was going to feel like. Like it's such a good feeling to be so aligned with what I want and my purpose, and it feels really good. So no, I can't say that I would do it differently. There's a little bit of a pang that it all happened so late because I'm 40, and I wasted so many years and I did dumb things for so many years. And now I have kids and I think about them growing up and I just, oh God, if they did the things that I did, wouldn't be able to sleep at night. So, there's a little bit of that I wish I wasn't so stupid. But if I didn't go through everything I went through, then I wouldn't have this story to share and this, which I think is really important. I think a lot of people are not doing what they want to do and they're in a dark place and they don't feel like they can get out of it. And I empathize and relate, and I feel really hopeful that my book can help people and my story can help people. So no regrets.
I love that. Okay, we have a closing tradition on this podcast where, okay, this is the closing question. If you had access to billboards across the world for a day, what message would you put up there?
You could have told me this before the call, Ishan.
Yeah, I know. I'm putting you on the spot, but I feel like putting people on the spot is the best way to get the most authentic answer.
Yeah.
It's. I mean, I know it's hard, but I know you
Yeah,
could do it.
the thing I'm thinking is something like, do what's fun. Do what's fun. I think everybody's not everybody. There's so much of trying to do what you're supposed to do and grinding and paying your dues and not enough of just following your intuition of like things that are fun. And I think a lot of time the fun thing is not the money thing. It might feel pointless. It might feel frivolous and a waste of your time. And that is what you should be doing. If it's fun and it lights you up and you forget what time it is because you're having so much fun, like you should make time to do those things.
Charlie, thank you for your time.
Thanks, Ishan. This was so fun.